Class, welcome to week one of PSC 583, Public Policy Analysis. So what we're going to be doing here in week one is really pretty simple. We're going to read some handouts from Smith and Lammer and Weimer and Vining. And we're going to start to get a sense of what exactly policy analysis is and what it isn't. I want to talk about a couple of kind of key concepts that you should know here if they're not words you're familiar with. One is the dichotomy between normative and positive, right? Positive research tends to be research into the nature of what is. And that's the simplest version of how to think about positivism. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to ask not how we want the world to be, not how in an ideal situation things would run, not how theoretically things could run, but just in fact, empirically, by our observations, what is, how are things right now. So that's the positive sort of nature of inquiry, and you don't have to believe that the whole universe can succumb to positivist inquiry, but it's a very useful tool and very common in empirical science, right? There is another form of inquiry, which is normative inquiry. Normative inquiry is about what you think should be, right? So should is really the key question when you're doing normative work. And why I'm telling you this is because when you think about different forms that maybe your capstone could take or maybe policy work could take, sometimes they're normative, sometimes they're positive, sometimes there's a blending of the two. There are post-positivist approaches. There are all kinds of other approaches. So you're going to learn a little bit about these sorts of different approaches today. But I want you to keep in mind, normative is about what should be and positive is about what is, as I use these words for the rest of the course. So as you get into policy analysis, I want to kind of try to make it a little bit clearer to you this week what a policy analysis is and what it isn't, right? So you could think about policy analysis as opposed to something like a policy evaluation or a policy proposal. And I want to be very clear about why you can think of it as an opposition, because it's a different form of writing. It's a different form of inquiry. A policy evaluation is very much typically a positivist empirical inquiry, right? It's about what is. The question at the heart of every policy evaluation is, did this policy meet its goal? How do you know what the goal is? The goal should be stated in either the legislative statutory intent, right? If it's not directly written into the law itself, it may be part of the hearing minutes or committee notes that are attached to bills at the state or federal level. So you can go back and figure out what were the contemporaneous conversations and arguments that the legislative or regulatory body was having before they either promulgated the regulation or passed a bill. And what you're trying to do is look for fidelity, right? You're trying to say, was the way that this policy was implemented and enacted in the real world done in a manner that comports with the intent of the people who designed the policy and approved it, the regulators and legislatures, whatever the case may be. And did it live up to their goals? Did it meet its stated goals, even if it was sort of designed with them in mind, right? Did it fall short? Did it exceed them? So these are things you should be able to measure in some sort of at least subjective, if not objective way, and at least a qualitative, if not in a quantitative way, right? With numbers that are kind of indisputable, ideally, or at least with qualitative assessments by experts, if it's the type of thing that can't be easily quantified. So that's what a policy evaluation is. They can take many forms. They can be process evaluations. They can be cost-benefit analyses. But that's not what we're doing in this course. I just want to be clear. On one side, there's that really positive inquiry, right? The policy evaluation. How is it working? Was it implemented well? Is it meeting its goals? Is the policy as it is enacted living up to what it was supposed to be when it was designed. Um, Now, if you look at the other side of things, on the policy proposal side, that's a much more normative exercise, right? Usually, when people are writing policy proposals, they're doing it um, because they're engaged in policy advocacy, right? Who writes policy proposals? But it could be lobbyists, it could be nonprofit organizations that want a lot of change for one reason or another. It could just be neighborhood organizations. It could be activist organizations. It could be you or me, right? It could be a professor or a student at a university who drafts up a statute or a policy and thinks, you know what, this would be good if it were implemented. Um, but it's about what should be. It's never about what is, right? It's about changing what is. It's about making policy more like what you believe would be effective and useful in the world. So in those kinds of proposals, you're trying to think about like what the goal should be, how maybe it should be measured, how you would like it to be enacted through legislation or through regulation or through maybe even the courts or some other means. Um, what should the goals be? How should they be designed? How should the definitions be defined? And you try to deliver all that or make those arguments before committees in the legislature when they have hearings, or you try to deliver it and get it introduced as a bill as is. That's a policy proposal. It's a very normative exercise, right? It's about changing the world. It's about making the world toward what you believe it should be. So your beliefs really matter for a policy proposal. For a policy evaluation, you really ought to put them aside and try to look at the world for what it is. Now, the policy analysis is somewhere in between those two. There's a normative component to it usually, but there's also a positive component to it. And what a policy analysis typically is useful for is it's useful for decision makers, right? And so you might imagine that you are working in the federal bureaucracy, in the state bureaucracy, in a city bureaucracy. Maybe you do, right? Maybe you have an executive branch job in municipal government or state government or federal government. Or maybe you have a job in a large nonprofit or a large state university or hospital or what have you. And what you might have to do is say, hey, I'm going to try to analyze one of our policies, and I'm going to try to look at what we're doing as business as usual. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually think about options for how we could change it, right? I'm going to develop maybe a menu of alternatives. And then I will ultimately make a suggestion for whether we should continue along the road we're on or whether we should make some changes and maybe implement one of the alternatives I explore and project out. But I am not the one making that decision necessarily, right? What I'm doing is I'm trying to lay it all out with a menu of options for my boss or my boss's boss or whomever is the ultimate decision-making authority that's examining this. It could be a committee. So in that case, that's really what we're doing in this course. And it's important to realize that the audience is shifting, right? And what you're trying to do is shifting. You might actually believe that by the criteria you select and the measurements you deem are important, you kind of know which alternative is best. But it's not your job to pick that alternative. It's your job to lay it out amongst the others and maybe try to make the case for why you believe it's best. But there may be other reasons why a different alternative will be chosen ultimately by the folks that you're doing the policy analysis for. So who might do a policy analysis? A consulting group might do a policy analysis. You might have just anyone who's employed doing policy work, especially on the executive branch side, doing a policy analysis for, say, a cabinet level secretary or a director of an agency or somebody even higher, right? You might be doing it for a mayor or a governor or what have you, even a president. So a policy analysis is a very advisory document. Right, you're advising someone saying, given the best research I have and the best knowledge I know, and given the available suite of alternatives that seem to be out there, here are the options, and here's the pluses and minuses of each option, and maybe ultimately here's why, if it were up to me, I would choose one of these options. But I'm laying it all out there for you to make the decision. I think that's the simplest way to put it. You're going to get a lot more information about this in your reading, so I encourage you to read them, and I encourage you, especially once we get into the textbook. The thing about the Eightfold Path, and I'll talk more about this in the next video, is that it's a very practical guide for policy analysis. One thing your boss or boss's boss or whomever may not want is a very technical document full of very long, complicated formulas and Greek letters. They want you to boil it down in the language that's understandable, the alternatives and the criteria that make sense to them that can be chosen between. And they don't really want that level of depth necessarily that more technical staff might want, right? You're not telling Dwight Eisenhower exactly what the engineering specs on a bridge are. He might just know that he wants 95 to be completed from Maine to Florida, right? So the question isn't always give me as much detail as humanly possible. It's break this down to relevant facts, alternative routes, and funding and ideas, and what can we get done and when can we get it done by, and what choices do I have to make here that are the big alternatives I could choose from. And what would you recommend as somebody who we're presuming is more of an expert, right? Is a little bit more technically minded than maybe the decision maker who's trying to weigh things. So that's what policy analysis is about in a nutshell. That's how it's different from an evaluation. It's how it's different from a proposal in a nutshell. And I hope that you find this video kind of helpful as you go forth and read this material this week and next week. I will be back next week with another short 10-minute video. Thank you.